And I'm your host, Adam Bushman. You can find me on Twitter at Adam_Bushman. And today we're doing our third look into the 2023 NBA draft that is quickly approaching us. March Madness is right on our doorstep, and so I wanted to get another installment of this before March Madness is here. And then after the tournament, and as we approach the end of the regular season for the NBA, then we'll do another installment. But today our guest is Mark. You probably know him on Twitter at MarkW_E01. Big Jazz and Falcons super fan and has a long history with NBA and NFL draft analysis. Mark, so happy to have you here, man.
Adam, thanks for having me. Excited to talk ball again. Haven't talked NBA draft in quite a while. So it's a fun draft class, and I know there's a lot of interest with especially with how the Jazz have been playing lately, but just with all the draft picks that we have in this year's class. So should be a good time, and thanks for having me on here. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's a super relevant draft as the Jazz kind of kickstart this new era. And Mark's going to break it all down for us. He released his big board for the first round less than a week ago, and so I quickly reached out so that we could get on the schedule and have this preview for you guys. Previously, we've talked to Josh Roberts and Leif Tulien, and we got some other people coming up as we get near the draft. But if you like what we're doing here on the Jabber Jazz podcast, please consider subscribing on YouTube or via your podcatcher, giving us a follow on Twitter at Jabber_Jazz, leaving a review or comment. Also, just lets us know that you're out there and keeps these podcasts rolling out. So without further ado, let's Jabber Jazz. All right, so this is our third installment of the 2023 NBA Draft Look-Aheads. And Mark, I just want to get your perspective on how you evaluate prospects, what kind of matters to you. So as you've been kind of going through your board and looking at all these different prospects, what matters or doesn't matter to you that's kind of different from consensus? Like, where do you kind of swerve in evaluation relative to maybe the industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something I have thought a lot about over the years. I've been scouting NBA players for, over a decade now. And my process has changed a lot during that time. And something I think, at a high level I've really settled on is I've learned that you really have to be diligent in looking for talent, right? And like that sounds really easy at a high level. It's like, well, of course you want to find the most talented players, but I think something that people, and I've done this too, but it's a trap that you can fall into, is you can find really good basketball players at the college level or internationally that are really really skilled. They're really productive. They do lots of good things. But from like a raw talent standpoint, and what I mean by that is like, do they actually have like the body type, the athleticism, the mindset, like the raw talent? Do they have that foundation underneath them to really be something at the next level? Because what I've learned, especially as I've done more scouting in person, is you just learn that these guys at the NBA level are just built different. Like they are just a different type of human being, and they are just on a whole other level. And you have to have the ability to match that and operate within that environment at the speed that the NBA game happens at to really have any sort of chance of being successful at that level. So I tend to be more like traits based in my analysis than maybe most people are. I really do put a lot of stock into those kind of components of a prospect. Do I really believe that are they built like an NBA player? Do they look like it? Do they feel like it? Do they smell like it? All those things, like there has to be some level of that to me to really love a player. And I think that's where I often diverge from a lot of other evaluators is I maybe put more stock in components like that versus other people. And then beyond that, I also put quite a bit of stock into the analytics side of things. So I know like Riley, for example, that everybody knows and loves on Twitter, he's much more analytics oriented. McCade is much more that way. I wouldn't say I'm that far on the analytics side of things. I feel like I'm more in the middle ground than they are on that front. But those two components to me are really kind of the foundational key pillars of my evaluation process. And I often find when I have big disagreements with people, it stems from those things. And kind of one other note on that is I typically don't worry as much about efficiency. Like, for example, is a player scoring super efficiently out of the pick and roll? I don't really care so much about if he's doing that efficiently. I care way more about if he's doing that at a high volume. To me, when you're looking at a player and trying to project them forward, high volume is a indirect indicator that they have several underlying skills in place that they need to succeed at a given thing, at a given task or skill at the next level, versus like a guy who's never done that thing or not done it at a high level, like probably doesn't have the underlying skills, right? So like pick and roll is a really good example where if a guy is running, you know, a ton of pick and rolls throughout the season, that means he's a good ball handler. That means the coaches trust him. He probably has pretty good basketball IQ, or else the coaches wouldn't trust him. He probably can pass in the pick and roll. He can probably score multiple ways out of the pick and roll. All those things have to be there for a player to be trusted to do that at a high level. And maybe he's not efficient at that right now, but that's where the development comes in, right? And you're not going to develop a player that is trying to do something wholly new that they've never done before, like run the pick and roll, right? Like if you take a guy that you're like, oh, I think he could do this, and now he's going to develop that at the next level, even though he's never done that before, that's just not going to happen, right? But a guy that's done that a lot and maybe just isn't super great at it yet, but he has all the underlying skills there, like he's got the bones of it, now you can work to add the meat on top of that through your development process, right? So I typically favor guys that are more high volume at a given skill set than other guys that are maybe way more efficient but are doing it at a much lower volume, because I've just seen that mistake happen time and time again where people think this guy doesn't do this right now, but he's going to do it in the future. And that rarely happens. You have to have some underlying foundational skill set to build your development on top of. So again, at a high level, that was maybe more than you wanted, but those are like kind of like the three pillars of how I evaluate. Just looking for the raw talent. Are they made of the right stuff? Looking for that high volume, right? Those kinds of things are really important to me.
No, I love that. It's, do they have the right recipe? And I liked how you talked about, volume over efficiency for those reasons. And I think a lot of our themes today as we go through your board are going to be process versus results. The results may not be there, but it's good process. And if it's good process with, the recipe of an NBA player, you should be betting on that. It doesn't mean you're going to bat 1,000, but you should be betting on that.
Totally. And that's like something you just have to recognize, right? Like at the end of the day, these are all gambles, right? And so your best chance of succeeding is just to bet on the players that objectively have the highest probability of hitting in some sort of way, right? Most of these guys are going to be busts. Most of them are going to be nothings. A lot more of them are going to be boring rotational guys that bounce around the league. Very few of these guys, even though we love a lot of them, there's a lot to like with a lot of them. Very few of these guys are actually going to hit and hit to the extent that you want them to hit to change your franchise, right? And there's so many variables that go into that. You could totally nail the scouting report of a player. They could have all the things that you want, but maybe they just go to a bad situation and it doesn't turn out, right? Like there's all of those environmental factors as well and variables that are totally out of your control. And that's why like everybody, no matter how good of a scout you become, everybody has misses, everybody gets lucky and has hits, and then there's everything in between, right? So I think at the end of the day, you have to remember that, and you just got to do your best to try and come up with some objective way and consistent way of putting these guys into buckets of probability outcomes, and that's about as good as you could do. And that's part of the fun. That's why I like doing it, but it's also part of the like the stress, right? Like I've had my fair share of guys that I've gone to bat for and then totally didn't pan out and you look like an idiot, but you just have to recognize like that's just the norm. You shouldn't feel bad about that or whatever, and there's something always to learn from that. So it's part of the fun. It's always something you can learn and grow at more year to year, which is part of why I love doing it. Is you've never arrived and you've never totally become what you want to be as a talent evaluator. So it's an endless rabbit hole of learning and growing, and I really love that about doing this.
So I love that you grouped your big board into tiers. I feel like tiers are really, really helpful for understanding how a draft is really constructed, and how your evaluations kind of group the prospects. So say when you've got a few players in a tier, and you said, hey, these are all pretty close facsimiles of each other in terms of the level of prospect. How do you go about breaking the ties? What are player archetypes or skills that you say, hey, these are about the same level of prospect, but prospect A has this thing that I love, and that breaks the tie. That puts them ahead of prospect B.
Yeah, another good question. It honestly, it kind of depends. It depends on the tier. So like guys at the top in my top tiers, I'll do that in a slightly different way where I'm looking for who I think has the best chance at becoming an elite player at their position, which is typically like an all-star or better, right? So if you're looking at like my tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 and even like tier 4, I'm trying to ask myself like who of this group has the best chance to be like a heavy hitter, a franchise changer, like somebody that is going to be that all-star player that I'm super happy with, or even to the level of they're going to be locked in as a long-term starter and I won't have to worry about that position anymore, right? Versus guys in my lower tiers, I'm just looking for somebody that I think can be a sufficient NBA player that they can stick on my roster, and I'm not going to bounce them in 2 or 3 years like Udoka Azubuike or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that's kind of changes, but really like part of how I look at it too is a couple other different things. Is one is in a given tier, my feeling really is like, hey, all these guys, like if you picked, like for example, if you look at my tier 3, I have Amon Thompson, I have Brandon Miller, and Asar Thompson, and I have them stacked in a certain order. But really, like the picks that range spans, I would be totally fine with those guys going at any of those picks in any order. I think they're relatively close, and I think you could make an argument for them at any one of those picks, and I would be okay with it, right? What I wouldn't be necessarily okay with is if you picked one of those guys over a guy in a tier above them, or if a guy in a tier below them got picked over them, right? I just think there's like
Yeah,
a
yeah.
talent difference in that tier. And part of how I've broken that down and how I've stacked it is, again, part of that's based on who do I just really think can be that guy for a team that is going to be that all-star level player or long-term starter. And then also sometimes I break it down by positional value, right? And this is like part of the interesting conversation with like Scoot Henderson and even Amon Thompson, who I think are point guards. And it's like, well, from a positional value standpoint, is that really the smart thing to do to take like an Amon Thompson over a Brandon Miller when Brandon Miller plays a way more valuable position in a position that's way harder to find that kind of level of a player at? I think there's an argument to be made for that, and sometimes I will flip guys based on that positional value tiebreaker, but sometimes I won't. It just it kind of depends, and to be honest, some of that comes down to just what my gut feeling is, and I've just learned to trust my gut over the years. So maybe not the most objective way to do it, but I usually feel pretty confident with my tier breakdowns and are pretty happy with how that plays out. But that's kind of how I approach that, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. Well, let's get right into the board then. In tier 1, and with your first slot, you have Victor Wembanyama. Tier 2, you have Scoot Henderson, and he would be at number 2 on your board. We've the industry, draft Twitter, everybody's been talking about Victor Wembanyama to death. There's really not anything really unique to kind of say about him. Scoot Henderson, close to the same thing, but I guess what I'm curious about for you have Scoot in tier 2 all by himself, and for you, what's keeping him in that tier all to himself? And preventing, say a Brandon Miller from ascending into that tier 2. What makes Scoot in your mind so special that he deserves his own tier?
Yeah, so this is a good one to talk about relative to what I've talked about so far, right? Because, like, to be honest, I don't love the positional value of Scoot Henderson at 2 overall, right? And like for a while there, I actually had Scoot, I think, all the way down at like pick 5, and I had him in the same tier as the tier 3 guys, the Thompson twins and Miller, because of that positional value debate, right? But at the end of the day, I actually went through an exercise that Riley put together where he surveyed myself and some other people about a lot of these players. And essentially how he broke down the survey was like, okay, rate this player on how likely you think they are to bust or to be a rotation player or to be a starter or an all-star or a Hall of Famer or like the best player ever, right? And as I went through that, what I realized is with Scoot Henderson, I just have a comfort level with him that like the most likely outcomes for him are going to be that long-term starter or an all-star, right? Above all the other things that he could become, I just feel like that is the most likely outcome for him. And versus like the Thompson twins and Miller, I still feel pretty confident that they're going to be a starter or an all-star, but there's just something about each one of them that they're just not like I don't feel as comfortable about that with them as I do with Henderson, right? So again, like at the end of the day, like he hits all the boxes that I'm looking for. He feels, he smells like an NBA player, like an elite NBA player. He's got all the things that you want there, right? He's got the stats that you're looking for. He's got the leadership intangibles. Like he's got all that right stuff. And like it's really easy for me to see him being a top 5 player at his position. Now is having like your number one guy being a point guard, is that great for trying to win a championship? Probably not. But I feel like he's going to be a player that's probably better than somebody like Trae Young. He's probably near like De'Aaron Fox and Halliburton. I think he's going to be better than Brunson. I don't think he's going to be better than SGA, but like you kind of start going down the list of like the top young point guards in the league, and it's like, yeah, I feel like this guy's going to be up there. And if I feel like the chances of him achieving that are pretty high, it's pretty hard to pass on like that known quantity and value even if the positional value isn't that great. So that's kind of how I view Scoot, and that's why he is in a tier above those other guys. He just has a more complete profile, and my comfort level and confidence in him is just a tick higher than those other guys. Not that I don't like those other guys or anything like that, or I don't think that their positional value is more important in some aspects, but there's just that extra little bit to Scoot that I think sets him apart from the guys below him.
Yeah, I think you said it pretty well there. I've kind of gone through my evaluation of various intangibles, offensive end, defensive end for Scoot, and there's still some areas that I need to kind of evaluate him more, but I was still surprised at just how well I felt he was grading against my personal rubric. And in many of the areas, it just felt like he had an elite foundation in so many areas on both sides of the ball, including the intangibles, that I do agree that he's a really just safe bet to be that starter and likely contending for all-star appearances
Right.
for a decade and a half, something like that.
Totally. I would love to ask you the same question that like the thought process that I went through. Like who do you think is like the best point guard in the league that like he can be better than in like the first 3 years, right? Like you start going down the list, it's like, okay, probably not Steph Curry, probably not Damian Lillard, but like at what point, like what name do you hit and you're like, yeah, I feel like Scoot's gonna be better than that player, right? Like what do you think about that?
I actually thought your comments about Brunson, De'Aaron Fox, that kind of grouping in the first 3 years, I think that's pretty likely that he's right in the mix of those guys. And with the way that De'Aaron Fox has played this year, Jalen Brunson has played this year, not saying that they're similar in how they play or the value that they provide as a player, but
Totally.
in terms of the aggregate of their production, I do think he's probably in that group. I would agree he's below the Ja Morant, the Steph Curry, the Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, definitely below that grouping. But yeah, you probably settled, and that probably means that he's at the very back end of top 10 at the position. And when you think about doing so in the first 3 years, that kind of being like your average or most likely outcome, I mean, people would sign up for that all day.
Oh, totally. Right. Like we're talking about all-star players, right? I mean, these like when the Halliburton trade went down, right? Like people lost their minds and he's like only been better since then. And it's like you could get a player like that. I mean, that's like a really valuable piece. Like Brunson, I mean, look at what he got paid this offseason, and he's not nearly as talented as Scoot. Look at what De'Aaron Fox is doing with the Kings, getting them to the playoffs. Like those guys are like really valuable players to their team. And like kind of what you were saying, that feels like the middle ground most likely outcome for Scoot. Like there's a high end outcome for Scoot where he is peak Chris Paul, or he's even like a Donovan Mitchell tier type player, or even like a John Morant. Like he gets into that top three conversation for his position. Like that's not crazy for his outcomes either. So it's like I get that high of a floor with him, and there's still a higher ceiling outcome potentially with him and all the tools and everything he brings to the table. I don't know. It's just really hard to push him down any further, especially when some of the other guys below him have like some pretty significant flaws. It's just I don't know. That's just kind of how I fell on my eval with him, and it was good for me to go through that exercise because, like I said, I got totally lost in the positional value rabbit hole, and I had him like down at 5 or something like that, and I was like, oh look, I'm like being so like clever, and then I just went back and I was like, what am I doing? Like what like what am I thinking at the end of the day? You know, this just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, that's just kind of my feelings on Scoot, and I totally understand why people have him at 2, and he's been a long-standing one at 2, and frankly I think he should stay there. I think maybe Brandon Miller will have an opportunity to try and knock on that door, but I'm pretty comfortable with having Scoot in that tier by himself.
All right, so let's talk about tier three. In tier three, at number 3, you have Amon Thompson. Number 4, you have Brandon Miller. At number 5, Asor Thompson. And this tier, this grouping is super interesting for me. You already mentioned how the order of these is maybe just slight personal preference, but that were these to be shuffled in any order on draft night, there would be zero issue in your mind from a team's evaluation of which one they decided to pick. But I recently watched quite a bit of tape of Amen and Asor and really kind of try to evaluate them via my rubric. And I just kept getting the feeling like in every category, each are like within 90% of the other in like every single category. Like saying that I mean, they are twins, but they even play like twins,
Yeah.
and we've seen some twins in the past, or brother combos in the past come through the league, and they all played drastically different. And these two, I feel like, play so incredibly similar. I'm really curious to you, like, what are some of the biggest differences that you find between these two?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is interesting because, like you said, I think they both do a lot that is really similar, right? But it's like a grading, like it's a sliding scale grade on that, right? But they're like within the same ballpark of each other on most of these things. What I would say though is, to me, there are at least a couple really key differentiating points between the two. Starting with Amon, I think Amon is a point guard, right? So he kind of reminds me more of like a John
Yeah.
Morant or like Alonzo Ball. Alonzo Ball. Asar, I think, is more of a wing, right? I know some people project him as like a 2. I actually think he's going to be like a 2-3 combo, and I actually think I would prefer him as a 3. And part of the reason why I say that is because Amon, to me, he's the much better ball handler, creator, and passer. Like to me, I feel like on day one I can trust Amon by putting the ball in his hands and say, okay, you are the engine that makes this offense go. You're the guy who's going to be running the show, and we trust you with the ball in your hands to make this happen, right? Asar, he has some of that playmaking ability, but he's more of a secondary ball handler and creator than he is versus Amon, right? Like Amon can do that on his own. He can be the guy running the pick and roll. He can create his own shot and create own shots for others off the dribble. But Asar, he does that more like within the flow of the offense, right? Like he'll throw a lob pass to a guy for an alley oop, or he'll make a pass to a cutter. But he can't really like, if he's the only guy on the floor tasked with running the offense and creating for others, that's just not really where he's at right now. So I think he's more of a secondary creator and ball handler versus Amon, who's primary. So that's one big difference. And then the other, I would say, actually is their shooting, which some people will disagree with me on, but I think as much as I love Amon, his jumper is like broken, right?
It is wild when you watch
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
it's suboptimal to say the least. And I have a hard time believing that he is going to make significant strides with his jumper, at least anytime soon, right? Whereas Asar's shooting mechanics are significantly better, in my opinion. And even though like the numbers will show that he doesn't really shoot like better from like a statistical standpoint. Like if you just go look at their like 3-point shooting, for example, they're almost identical. But like you go watch the tape, and Asar, his mechanics are just way better. He's ascending, like he's improving slowly, and this will even show up in the metrics. Like some of his free throw shooting is improving, where Amon's is still flatlined. And Asar also just like looks comfortable shooting. Like he shoots off the dribble, he takes like stationary shots, right? Like when he's in the corner, and he does it like confidently. Whereas like Amon, when he's shooting, it like still looks very awkward and uncomfortable. So I think Asar is just a much better shooter right now, and he's ascending as a shooter. And I think his jump shot projects much better moving forward in terms of development. So yeah, I think those are like the two big ones. Amon really has him over the creation and ball handling, but Asar I think is the much better shooter both now and moving forward.
Yeah, I really appreciated what you mentioned about the positions, because I'd kind of pegged them both as being able to guard on the defensive end, both guards and wings.
Yeah.
But then on the offensive end, I did peg Asor as a wing and Amon as a guard. And when I went through some of the stuff that they do on offense, I definitely got the feeling that Amon has a bit more wiggle. Amon has a better handle. And I think they both have passing talent, but Amon just has that. He just has that like extra, little bit of magic, that you
totally
see with LaMelo Ball, that you see with, even Tyrese Halliburton, frankly, that are just putting that extra bit of muster on the passes that just kind of blows you away.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Like I always call it like the special sauce. Like he's got this little special sauce to him where you can't really quantify it, but when you watch, there's just like an intuitiveness, like an instinct to it, and just like a flair to it that gets into that special tier, right? Whereas like Asar just doesn't quite have that. Like he's a nice passer. Like I don't have concerns about him being able to pass and like create. I just don't think he's gonna be that guy, right? And so that's like kind of where you break it down. Like my comp for Amon is more like a Ja Morant or like one of the Ball brothers, whereas like Asar is more like a Paul George or like a Jaylen Brown, which are both like great potential outcomes. They're just different, right? And they play very different roles.
I was also digging into some of the process shooting numbers for Amon and Asor. We were talking about volume, and I looked at how often are these two getting threes relative to how often they shoot, and so Asor is besting Amon in the frequency of threes compared to the amount of shots they take. So
yeah,
he's got a better 3-point rate. You also talked about his mechanics being better. Asor is getting to the free throw line more than Amon, and when you mentioned the strides he's gaining there. So, when I think about Asor's shooting, I still do think he's a slightly below average shooting prospect.
Totally.
Whereas Amon, I'm just thinking. Oh, and I should say I kind of have pegged Scoot as like an average shooting prospect. Like outside shooting prospect.
Yeah, Scoot's more like a scorer than a shooter, right?
Yeah. But Amon, man, just from the mechanics, some of those process numbers, I have him really, really below average, like in that bottom 25%, as a shooter. He does so much other well that he's gonna, he's a great prospect. But I do see a pretty decent divide between those two in the shooting department. Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. And I think like those numbers, back to what you were saying there with like the volume and everything, that to me that just shows, and like this shows up on their tape, Amon just doesn't look comfortable doing that. Where like Asar, that's like part of his game. It's not fully formed. Like he hasn't reached like peak tier Pokemon with his shooting, right? But you can tell like he's on his way there. And whereas Amon just has a lot more to go, even just to get comfortable taking them, let alone making them and making that a part of his game, right? Which is a big difference.
So you mentioned that exercise that Riley, put you and I both through, along with some others, in kind of identifying the range of outcomes and their likelihood for each of these prospects. So like, let's assume that Asor stays as a below average shooter in the NBA, and Amen is in the bottom 25% of shooters in the NBA. So like, let's say, those skills stay exactly as they were kind of billed pre-draft. Like what's the ceiling for those two in terms of like players or even just like the outcomes of them being like a solid starter or rotation, etc.
Yeah, so looking just at like their potential outcomes for starter and all-star, right? On that survey that we did with Riley. So for Scoot, and this is where Scoot differentiates himself from them, I had very likely for starter and very likely for all-star. But for the Thompson twins, I had very likely for starter and then just likely for all-star. And the likely component comes in mostly because of what we're talking about is their limitations, predominantly as a shooter, right? So that's kind of how that breaks down for me. And specifically with Amin, I do compare him to Ja Morant a lot just because he's such an explosive athlete and he's just, I don't know, there's just a lot about him that remind me of Ja coming out. And like Ja didn't have a great jumper coming out either. The problem is Amin's jumper is way more broken than Ja's jumper was coming out, right? So I think that's like kind of a high end comp for him. But let's say his like shooting never develops. I think something like Lonzo Ball is a good comparison. And I know Lonzo, once he got in the league, really did a lot of work on his jumper, and that kind of came around before he got hurt. But the reason I kind of like that comp is because Lonzo is still a starter, right? And like you're pretty happy with Lonzo as a starter. Like he does a lot for your team and helps you to win. And I actually think Amin is like a way better defender than Lonzo is. So he has actually a little bit more to add than even Lonzo would with that comparison. But like ultimately because of like the lack of shooting, a Lonzo Ball type player, even though you're happy with them as a starter, well, maybe not even happy with them as a starter, like they can be your starter long term, you may not totally be happy with them. It may be one of those things where it's like, okay, they're starting for me, they're helping my team, they're being productive, but I'm always kind of left wanting more. I think that is a potential outcome for Amin if his jumper doesn't develop. And I think ultimately that would be disappointing considering where you pick him. Just like Lonzo, I think has been a disappointment for where he was drafted and the hype he had coming into the league. I could totally see that happening to Amin. Not that he's a terrible player or anything. It just is not kind of what you were looking for. If you get Lonzo Ball instead of John Morant, that's like not ideal, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so that's kind of how I feel at with him. For Asar, it's a little bit more tricky, just because I do think he's high in outcomes over like a Paul George or a Jaylen Brown, right? I actually really love the Jaylen Brown comp because Brown had a lot of the similar strengths, but also similar weaknesses. But then he's been able to develop those things and really become what he is today. But it's like, well, what if he doesn't? Like, what if Jaylen Brown never developed a jump shot? Like, what is he, right? It's actually kind of hard to figure out what that would look like. Like, is that Cam Reddish? Like, who is that? Like, who's this guy who's a wing, athletic, talented, but like doesn't really like shoot or score or help at like the wing position? I don't know. That one's a little bit more tricky, and that's typically why I have Asar lower in that tier is because it feels like his floor, if the bottom falls out, could be like really low, whereas with like Amin or Miller, like they just have a little bit more high floor skills that they're starting with. So I don't know. That's kind of how I feel about that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that though.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of felt like if with the passing skills, I kind of felt like you're they end up being like 80% of Ben Simmons before the disaster series against Philadelphia,
Yeah.
where hey, you're 80% of Ben Simmons, so you might be an all-star when everybody's excited about you in your third year and you're putting up all these numbers, but you can't shoot. But you're probably not getting your All NBA bid like Ben Simmons did. But
Yeah.
then long term, like I don't see either of them near as timid from a shooting standpoint as Ben Simmons. And so I don't know that confidence in one's shot or lack thereof is as big of a concern with these two as it kind of has borne out with Simmons. It's possible, but I kind of felt like if the shot kind of never comes around for those two, especially they're probably like a 75% of Ben Simmons pre that Philadelphia series that literally just broke him in many ways.
Yeah, and I actually like that comp because one of the great things I love about both of them is their defense, right? Like these guys both defend at a high level, and that was
Oh
like
yeah,
a
yeah.
huge part of what made Ben Simmons like still valuable, even though he couldn't shoot. Is he just was like a complete lockdown menace of a defender. And I think both the Thompson twins have that ability in them for each of their positions. And what I think too, I would say though, is like, and this is part of the reason I love the Thompson twins so much is they like from a mentality and attitude standpoint are way better than Ben Simmons, right? Like Ben Simmons came in super entitled, super arrogant, like, and he still is that way today, right? And like now he's just loafing it, right? But like I don't ever see the Thompson twins being like loafers in the league or like having that kind of bad toxic attitude. Like I think they really are made of the right stuff. So sometimes it's hard to figure out what would that look like if they don't totally develop like some of these skills. But like I feel pretty confident that they're always going to be in the league and helping teams out just because they do so much and they have that defense, they have the right attitude. Like they're going to find a way to help a team win games, right?
Let's move on to your tier 4. This one is also really interesting. So in tier 4, we have at 6, Jarris Walker of Houston, 7, Cam Whitmore of Villanova, 8, Gigi Jackson of South Carolina, 9, Anthony Black of Arkansas, and 10, Jet Howard of Michigan. So this one is really interesting. Yeah, you have Jarris Walker just ahead of Cam Whitmore. Because, we're doing, just ordinal one after the other rankings, it's very difficult to communicate just how close the prospects are. So I wanted to just see if you would comment on what made you put Walker just ahead of Whitmore in your evaluation.
Yeah, so I really love both players, especially for the Jazz. Like these are two of my personal favorites. It was tricky to try and stack those guys. I think ultimately the reason why I stacked Walker ahead of Whitmore is because at the end of the day, so Walker's going to play the 4, right? I really think he's going to be a power forward in the league, whereas Whitmore's going to be a 2 or a 3, kind of a combo guard/wing, right?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
And so the reason I bring that up is because both players, in many regards, they're like good at a lot of things, but they're a master of none, and they're both elite level athletes for their positions, right? But for Walker, like being good at a lot of things, but the master of none is actually kind of what you want at the modern 4 in the NBA. Like you kind of want that Swiss Army knife versatile 4 that does a little bit of everything. He doesn't necessarily need to be the master of any one thing to be really valuable and helpful as a starter in that position. Whereas like Whitmore as a 2 or 3, you have got to do something at an elite level to really like last there as a starter. Like you can't have a 2 or 3 that is kind of just okay at dribbling, just kind of okay at passing, just kind of okay at shooting. Like his best thing is his defense, but it's like if you're a 2 or 3 in the NBA that plays really good defense, but you can't really dribble, pass, or shoot, and I'm not saying like he won't do those things eventually, but right now he's just okay at those things. He's not really great at any of those things. That's just a lot harder to make work, right? Like those guys get replaced really easily all the time. Right. So to me, that was where I kind of gave that tiebreaker to Walker was I feel like he's just way more likely to be like a plug and play long-term starter and has like that higher floor. Whereas Whitmore, he's got some development to do. And so I feel like his floor is much, much lower. And the potential of him hitting his ceiling is also going to take a lot more work from a skill development standpoint, but then also just from like a brain basketball IQ standpoint. It's just harder to play the 2 or 3 versus the 4 because you're more on ball and doing more with the ball, right? So that's ultimately how that broke down. But I really like both players and super interesting guys for Jazz fans to keep their eye on.
Yeah, I can't imagine that the Jazz wouldn't be trying to move heaven and earth if either of those guys slipped past 7 or 8. Even if the Jazz are 12 or 13 with their own pick, I would imagine that the Jazz, especially just given Danny Ainge and his reputation, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and all these guys that he's drafted in the past, I'll bet they'd be trying to move heaven and earth, several of the the long-term picks to try to move up to get one of those guys.
Totally.
With Walker, I think what kind of makes him really, really special and interesting, in my opinion, is I guess we've seen both of these guys in a reduced role. Cam Whitmore going to Villanova, you thought, hey, that's actually going to be awesome. But it turns out that the coach, the scheme, how bad they ended up being kind of a terrible situation for him, oddly enough. And then Jarris Walker in Houston, I mean, they were just so stacked that he's really in just a complementary role. I mean, it's, he's definitely taken big back seats to, Marcus Sasser and others. But I think what makes Jarris Walker so interesting is that he's performing this well, by being kind of that complementary piece. And
Right.
you put him on a Utah Jazz or a team poised to kind of break out of their losing, being kind of like a mid to early mid first round pick. I think he could slot in there immediately, making good impact because he's good on defense, he can shoot, and then I think he's got a little bit of that special sauce for the passing. We're not seeing it a ton because he doesn't have the ball a ton, but there was, I think it was a play against SMU where you could tell that it was a play to get him a 3-point shot off the left wing, and he got it, and he was about to go up, but then he saw the other forward flashing into the paint, and just within a split second, he totally changed his movement and whipped a pass right in there for a layup. And I was just like, wow. Like, they clearly knew what the play they were going to get, and they got it. But in just a moment's notice, he read a better play and pivoted on a dime to just put a spot-on pass to that cutter. And so that just kind of gave me the impression like, oh, man, that could be a really special skill at that forward position with his size.
Totally, yeah. That's one of the reasons why I love him so much, and I love the potential fit with the Jazz. Like, I'm not saying he's Draymond Green level with his passing, but he does have an abnormally unique ability to make great passes from that position at his size, right? So he's kind of got like some Julius Randle to him with his offensive game, but then I'll add a little bit of like Draymond Green's passing ability. I think like some combination of those guys is kind of what you're hoping for in terms of his ceiling potential outcome. And like you drop either one of those guys into the Jazz's lineup as the four, that's like pretty exciting. Like we've talked about John Collins, like potentially trading for him, and
Yeah.
I like Collins. He's like pretty good offensive player, right? But like he's not like a great defender, not a great passer. Like with Walker, you could potentially get a John Collins level like offensive scoring threat plus the defense, plus the rebounding, plus the passing. Like that can potentially be a really exciting fit and a really exciting player for them. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of Walker, and he's like one of my top guys that are fairly realistic for the Jazz that I would love to see them get.
So at 9, you have Anthony Black of Arkansas. 6'7", 195 pounds, 19 years old. Really took over basically all of the guard responsibilities for a really poorly shooting Arkansas team when Nick Smith Jr. went out with injury. He's really impressed. I saw Tony Jones say on Twitter that he believes Anthony Black is Josh Giddey to a T. Josh Giddey was drafted 2 years ago to Oklahoma City Thunder. What do you make of that comp?
Yeah, it's funny. So Tony and I have actually talked about Anthony Black quite a bit and his comp to Josh Giddey. I actually really love that comp. Josh Giddey is like really a pretty unique player in many regards with his size and his ability to handle the ball and then his passing. And he's like another one of these guys that has that like special sauce with the passing, right? The things I don't love about the comp though is I think Anthony Black is just a significantly better athlete than Josh Giddey. Not to say that Giddey's like some, schmuck and like a bad athlete, but to me he's like just kind of average. Whereas like Anthony Black can be like pretty explosive as an athlete. He has like some really explosive finishes at the rim. Defensively, he's just much more quick and explosive than Giddey is. Like he just has that like quick twitch, explosive factor to him that Giddey doesn't. So yeah, the way I've kind of described it is I think he's Josh Giddey plus, right? So he's everything that Josh Giddey is, the great passer, high basketball IQ, special sauce there, but he's just much more explosive. And then they both struggle with their shooting, and that will be one of the biggest things that they got to figure out at the next level. But the underlying skill set that they bring in the basketball IQ, that usually translates really well to the league, and very similar to Amin Thompson, like. Even if their shooting never gets figured out, they still help your team win because they do all like the really important kind of glue stuff that holds a team together, right? So it's just really easy to see how Anthony Black, just very similar to how Giddey has been impacting Oklahoma City, he's just gonna like raise the tide. That's gonna raise all boats because he does all these little things that just you want your players in your team to be doing, right? So I'm a big fan of his. I love Anthony Black.
Yeah, I like what you mentioned about the athleticism. I was reminded of a play when Arkansas just hosted Kentucky. Anthony Black got down on the low block, and he was being covered by Kentucky's big star big man Oscar Shibwe, big dude, and ended up picking up his dribble. Now he's stuck down on the low block. Oscar Shibwe's in his way, and Black's defender comes and doubles him, and he's moving his pivot foot, and he's faking passes, and he gets some separation, and he just goes off of 2 feet and two-hand dunks it.
Yeah.
I could never imagine in a million years Josh Giddey doing something like that.
Yeah, Giddy will kind of do that thing, like he'll kind of catch a guy off guard and like drop the hammer on somebody's head. But like Black can just like straight up go over the top of somebody and like throw it down, right? Or like they've ran some like lob plays to Black, and I'm like, there's just no way you would ever see Giddy get like a lob play ran to him like that, where like or like Black will cut down the middle and they'll like throw a lob to him coming down the lane, almost as if he's like a big man on the roll, and like Black will punch those in, So yeah, that part of his game and his profile, super exciting, right? Like that's another really good example of like a guy that I watch and I'm like, okay, like this guy has like the underlying bones and like feel and look and smell of an NBA player. Like you can just see him easily competing with like the best athletes in the world at the speed that the NBA game is played at. And then he has like some really cool, fun, exciting skills on top of it. So very cool player. I love Anthony Black.
So Jet Howard at number 10 is the last guy in tier 4. I think he kind of epitomizes traits and process over results. Give me a sense of why you're high on Jet Howard enough to put him in top 10. I mean, you're sometimes seeing him 15, 16, 17 on some boards.
Yeah, this I found after I posted my initial takes on my big board that like this was like maybe the most spicy guy, like with how I ranked him, and I was a little surprised. But yeah, the real reason, the kind of the core reason why I have him this high is I think he definitely he has his struggles defensively. He's not a great passer. He's not like a great rebounder, and like those are things that like especially analytically is not great to not be great at, right? But that being said, for a guy his size, with how tall and long he is and athletic he is, his offensive game and especially his shooting are just really impressive and are frankly like really really rare, especially to have him doing what he's doing as a shooter and a scorer as a freshman, right? So specifically, like he's taking like over 7 3-point attempts per game, right? And he's shooting 37% on those, which is like more than efficient enough in my mind, especially at that high of a volume. And just the fact that he can take more than 7 threes a game is at his age is and at his side is super unique and rare, right? Like you just don't find guys that are like 6'7" plus that can do that and shoot it at like a high level, at a high volume. Trying to find a wing like that can do that is just almost impossible to get. Like if you have a guy like that on your team in the NBA who's taking 7 threes a game and shooting almost 40% on them, and they're 6'7" plus, like you're probably never trading that player. And if you do, you're gonna get like a first round pick plus for them, right? So it's like I understand he's got all these weaknesses and other things about his game that are concerning, but like that one thing alone is tremendously valuable and gives him like a really high floor, right? I mean, like what he's doing as a freshman at his size is better than what Klay Thompson did at this same point in his career. And Klay Thompson was playing against significantly less talented competition, right? So I'm like, I don't know. Like there's a part of me that thinks Klay Thompson is in his range of outcomes. And to me, that seems like that'd be worth a top 10 pick. And I think like at worst, maybe he's like a Cam Johnson who also is like a super valuable player. Like,
Oh yeah.
like those guys just are really valuable if they can shoot at that size. And then beyond that, so like that alone, I think justifies the top 10 pick evaluation in terms of value for him. But then I also think there's some components about his offensive game, like his ball handling, his ability to create his own shot, and like get to the rim that I think are way underrated. And if those things continue to develop, Like, man, now you're talking about a guy who can shoot a ton of threes at his size at a high percentage and can do something off the dribble and like get and finish at the rim. Like, I don't know. To me, that's like super exciting. So that's really why I have him up here. Not to say he doesn't have his warts, and that's why he's at the bottom of that tier when I stacked it. But man, that's a pretty exciting and rare combination of skills to find in a guy like that.
All right, let's go to Tier 5. So in Tier 5 at 11, you have Grady Dick of Kansas, 12, Taylor Hendricks of UCF, 13, City Sissoko, G League Ignite, 14, Keontae George, Baylor, 15, Nick Smith Jr. of Arkansas, and 16, Cason Wallace, Kentucky. I want to do a little quick pitch. So I'm going to say a player and just give me like a 2-minute pitch of why you're either high relative to consensus or why you're low relative to consensus on these two players. So quick pitch, City Sissoko at 13.
Okay, so this is my guy. So I'll try and keep it short. But I found that I'm much higher on him than consensus. The reason is he's a 6'8" wing slash guard combo. I really think he's a small forward, probably could potentially even play power forward because he's so big and strong. He's like 200 pounds. But he's an explosive leaper. He's only 18 years old. He's about to turn 19 in April, and he projects really well as a 3-and-D guard slash wing. But he's another one of these guys, like when you watch him, he's got some of that special sauce on him. He's super explosive. Like he has some like special finishes at the rim where he's like dunking over people and you're like, holy crap. Like what did I just watch? Like who the heck is this guy? But he's also got a surprisingly good ability to make passes and he's a pretty good shooter too. So he's got all the underlying tools that I've talked about that I really love. But then he's got some kind of special flashes to his game that you're like, man, if he can do that on a consistent basis, this guy could be something really special. So to me, I see him like really easily being like, somebody that the Jazz fans know really well. Like think of like Royce O'Neal and how much everybody loved him and how valuable he was as a starter. City, I think, can do everything Royce did and then probably do some things a lot better. And he's starting at a much younger point than Royce did with his NBA career, right? So if you get Royce O'Neal plus, that's pretty darn good. And Royce just got traded for like a late first round pick. Like what could City do and be worth if he develops better ball handling? He's a more explosive athlete. He's a better passer than Royce O'Neal. Like that guy, I think, is pretty easily worth a lottery level pick. So yeah, he's somebody that I think people are overlooking. But man, I would love him on the Jazz, and I think he is really, really exciting.
Well, and it's interesting that you have him so high here because in many of the mocks that I've seen recently, he's at the back end of the first round.
Crazy. That's crazy
it's
to me.
possible that it's possible that he's on the board when the Jazz are picking with that pick they got from the Brooklyn-Philadelphia deal.
Yeah, to me, I frankly really have a hard time believing that's going to be the case. Like if he goes late first, I will have some major questions for NBA people because I don't know. Like when you look at him, I just don't see why he should go that low. What are the reasons why you're not higher on him?
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
It's I struggle with that one. And like even things like he played on the FIBA 2021 U18 league for France, and Rupert, the guard forward from France, who's also like a common lottery level projected pick in this class, he was better than Rupert. I don't know. And then he's gone to the G League where he's playing against like NBA caliber players and he's like killing it. Right. So, I don't, if the Jazz could get him with their Brooklyn pick, oh man, I would be super, super happy. He's one of my favorite players in the class. And I think he would be a tremendous fit for the Jazz for like a million different reasons. So, that's my pitch on City. If you haven't watched him, you got to go watch him. He's my guy.
Yeah. I've watched him a little bit and just, I was primarily watching Scoot, but I was seeing some plays, but I got to go zero in on him a bit more. Another guy in this tier that you're kind of swerving a bit relative to consensus is Cason Wallace. What's your quick pitch there?
Yeah, well, so I want to flip this back to you a little bit. So what with Cason makes you feel like he should be higher on my board than where I have him? Because it feels like I'm lower on him than consensus, so I'm curious to hear like your pitch of why you think he should be higher.
We talked about Jarris Walker, that at his position, he's got the foundation in basically every skill you want. And I feel like that same type of approach could be taken with Kaysen. You look at every component that you kind of want in a guard. I think he's got that foundation. I think he's got enough size, enough strength already. As a just 19-year-old. I think he's playing on a Kentucky team that is really just about getting Oscar Tshiebwe the ball, basically. And I think he's kind of been marginalized quite a bit there, but he's still showing flashes. I do think he's probably the best guard defender in the draft, at least in this first round. I've been impressed with his shot, and he's also creating more for himself than I ever thought. Like I said, I think the whole Kentucky offense is about getting Oscar Tshiebwe the ball.
Yeah.
And Kaysen, the volume that he is getting, it's mostly to do with, his own self-creation. And I definitely value self-creation because, there's going to be times where if you hope to ever achieve your ceiling, you've got to kind of prove that you can get yours and kind of bail teams out, and that's kind of what helps, in my opinion, a player to kind of achieve their true ceiling. So that's kind of what I'd say on Kaysen. Yeah.
Yeah, he's somebody I really like him. He'd be fun on the Jazz. I agree with you. Like, amazing defender. Like, I don't know. Like, there's like part of me that's like, this dude could be like Gary Payton level defensive player. Like, he is special on that front, which is really fun. Where I really struggle with him, and I think it's interesting to hear your comments about this, is his offense. Like, when I think about his offensive game, I think he does a lot of things really well, right? I think he does a lot of things good enough. But like, what part of his offensive game will you ever feel confident in saying he's like a top 15 player in the league as a point guard at that given offensive skill?
You make a great point. I mean, he hasn't shown the passing like you've seen with Anthony Black. He hasn't shown that I don't know, that ability, that wiggle to create like Jet Howard has.
Right.
So, you can't hang your hat on any one thing, I don't think, on offense. It's more of like, you just see the totality and you're like, oh, wow, that's a starting guard who's, keeping our head above water from day one type thing.
Yeah, and that's an interesting way that you put that. Like, okay, he's a starting guard who's keeping our head above water. Like, I think that's a good way to put it, though, right? Like, he's gonna keep you above water, which is fine. But I think he's one of those guys where like the ceiling to me just isn't there, and I think he would always be a guy that you're like looking for like an upgrade for, right? Like, I actually think he would be somebody I would love him coming off my bench and like just being a defensive menace. But as a starter, I'm just kind of like, yeah. Like, I gotta roll out Kaysen against like Steph Curry or like SGA. Like, he's gonna do really good on defense, but like, how much is he gonna really make the other team pay on offense? Can he really like run the show on that end? Can he score and go get me buckets when I really need him to? Like, is he that guy? Like, I don't know. I just don't think he's gonna do that, right? So that's kind of why I'm lower on him. I'm like,
yeah,
I like you, but like, I feel like your floor is super high. Like, he's gonna be in the NBA forever, and people will love him to have him on their team, but like, I just don't think you're gonna love him as a starter, and that's kind of why I have him fall all the way down to 16 on my big board.
Yeah, I kind of feel like if some things go wrong, he's probably DeAnthony Melton.
Potentially.
Yeah, if things don't go wrong, but he never like achieves a ceiling, and he's kind of the NBA version of what he already is. I think that's probably Marcus Smart on offense, and then, I don't know, maybe 80-90% of Marcus Smart defensively, and I think that'd be a great starter.
Yeah, Marcus Smart maybe is like a great comparison. He doesn't have the versatility defensively like Smart does. Like, he's not going to be guarding 5s and 4s,
right, yeah.
But like, he can guard like your 1s and 2s and just be a menace. The guy I always kind of bring up with him is Jose Alvarado, who like is super, super small, right? But he's just a complete menace on defense, and then he can hit some shots and do some things on offense. I think he's like Alvarado plus, right? Like, he's just bigger and like, but probably is going to do a lot of the similar things, which is like fine. I don't know. He's not like some explosive leaper or player. He's not like totally amazing creating his own shot or shots for others. Like, I don't know. Like, there just isn't that that part of his offensive game that gets me super stoked. So I like him. I would be fine if we took him. I just wouldn't be like, oh, this is gonna be like the guy who's gonna like change our franchise or something like that, you know?
So as we get into Tier 6, your Tier 6 spans the number 17th pick through the end of the first round. And what I kind of noticed when I went through this group is you have Bryce Sensabaugh at 25.
Yeah.
This one, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. He's been somebody who's getting a lot of buzz in the industry, really talked about as a lottery pick. And so I'm curious to see what you're missing from Bryce Sensabaugh to I don't know, kind of have him in the next tier up.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious to hear what I'm missing because I feel like I'm way lower on him than pretty much everybody. And I know, like, my guy Josh Roberts that you know and we all know on Twitter, like,
oh, that's his guy.
That's his dude, right? And like every time he sees a mock draft and we get him, he's like stoked, and I'm like, man, I hate that pick for us. But yeah. So here's the thing with Bryce Sensabaugh. So this goes back to what we talked about to open the show. Like I'll favor the guy that's doing something at high volume but low efficiency over the guy who's doing something at low volume but high efficiency, right? But the golden, like the golden ticket is when you find a guy who's doing something at high volume and is doing it at a high efficiency. Yeah. And that's like what Bryce Sensabaugh is doing, right? So typically when I see guys like this, like for like one guy, for example, that was kind of sort of similar to this. He wasn't really all that efficient, but like last year, like Cam Thomas was a guy I was way higher on than consensus because I was like, dude, this guy is like doing all this stuff at high volume and like pretty good efficiency, and he's doing it as like a young player, and that's kind of played out in the season. Like it's really clear he went way too low. So like you would think Bryce Sensabaugh would be a guy that I would love, but like he's kind of like Kason in the sense where I watch him and I'm like, I don't know, like he's doing really well, but like a lot of this stuff that he's doing, especially with Bryce, I just don't feel like is like translatable, right? Like he just is not a very good athlete. Like he lives on a lot of contested jumpers. He struggles to create separation. Like he kind of has to play this bully ball, and he's just like kind of bigger than these other guys. And I'm like, to me, I'm like that just doesn't like translate, especially at his size and for a guy who lacks that explosive athleticism. Like that typically just doesn't work out very well for those guys. Great basketball player, like great college player, right? But like if you take him and put him in the NBA game, I just think that he's really going to struggle. He's just way too ground bound and like just can't do all that same stuff that he's doing right now. He's not going to be able to do that at the NBA level. So like the guy I always compare him to is like Grant Williams. Grant Williams coming out like got so much hype. Like I remember people had him in like the top 5, like the top 10. Everybody loved Grant Williams, great player, but he was undersized, not like this great athlete, but he just was good at basketball, high IQ, did a lot of the intangible stuff, like all of this stuff that like doesn't show up on the stat sheet but helps the team win. And like people went crazy for that and it really juiced his ranking. But like at the end of the day, I was like the guy, I'm like, yeah, but like what's the ceiling? Like what's the upside? Like he may be a great rotational player for you, but is he going to be a starter that you're like happy with? And to me, I get that same feeling with Bryce where I'm like, yeah, like he maybe he's like the Grant Williams of like your guards, but like are you going to spend would you trade a lottery pick for Grant Williams right now? No, like nobody's going to do that because he doesn't have the upside. He's never going to be like a franchise changing talent. He's not going to be an all-star. He's probably never going to be a starter that you're consistently happy with. Great player, great guy to have on your team, but like to me that's like a late first round guy, and that's how I see Bryce. So I don't know, maybe I'm like way off on that, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts because that's what I get when I watch Bryce.
I listened to a podcast recently where the host said that the intel he's kind of getting is that that Bryce's agent is going to encourage him to slim down a little bit before the draft, drop 10, 15 pounds or whatever.
Good advice.
So he is just lean and mean. And with his ability to create, the theory of this host is that opposing agents for other players who you'd normally schedule a team workout with Bryce are going to be just running away from those workouts, trying to schedule their guy with anybody but Bryce, because Bryce is just going to own them because of his size. When he sheds a little bit of weight, I mean, he's just going to be lean and mean. and then his skills of creating his own shots and stuff are just going to paint opposing prospects in a poor light. So
Interesting.
say he does slim down a little bit, comes into the NBA, doesn't have to create as much, but still gets far easier shots, right away. I agree with you. I don't know what that type of player is, but I think that's probably a lottery pick.
Interesting. See, I that's so interesting. I part of me is like, I'll have to wait and see it to believe it, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
does slimming down actually help him, right? Because like to me, a lot of his game is like playing that bully ball. So like slimming down, I'm like, I don't know, like if he can't play bully ball anymore, that might actually hurt him. And like to invoke somebody that we all love dearly here in Utah Jazzland, like look at like Desmond Bain, right? Like to me, I'm like, can he be Desmond Bain? Because if he can, then I'm like super interested, and that definitely is a lottery level
Yeah, yeah.
talent. But I think if you compare Desmond Bain to Bryce, I think Bain is like a significantly better prospect than Bryce is. And to me, I'm like, that's pretty telling. Like if Bryce went up against Bain in a workout at this same stage in their careers, I actually think Bain would have taken him to school. So I don't know. I'm not saying like that couldn't change and like slimming down couldn't help him, but I don't know. I just don't. I just don't see that with him. But I love the differing opinions on him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In this big tier 6, who's the best fit for the Jazz?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of guys in there. I'll just like rattle off their names. I won't spend a ton of time on them. And there's some guys that I've watched since posting this that I think would fall into that tier that I'd also really love. So I think obviously like the guys near the top of that tier would make a lot of sense. Like Maxwell Lewis, really high upside guy, shows some crazy flashes. He's like a 6'7", explosive leaping, long stride running, kind of guard wing. That can shoot and kind of do a lot of things. Really interesting player, but he's super raw skill wise, and he's just totally beating up on like super low level competition. He's somebody that I find really interesting, just given the size, athleticism, skill combination. But man, he's somebody I would really like to see play at the combine, just to see how he plays against better comp. Because I don't know, sometimes I watch him, I'm like, there's just no way any of this translates. So I need to see him do this in the context of like not playing against guys who are going to be
Yeah.
doing something else other than basketball for the rest of their life. But he's really interesting. Dariq Whitehead is a guy I really loved for a long time who's kind of fallen down a bit, but he has some Harrison Barnes to his game where he's kind of a bigger bodied guy, not some great athlete. I think Barnes is actually a much better athlete than him at this stage, but he can shoot, he can dribble, really high IQ player, really hyped player coming out of high school. I think just a guy like that with that size, the ability to shoot would be really interesting. And he's just got the intangibles that you want. I think a guy like Jordan Hawkins would be interesting as kind of like a Jordan Clarkson potential replacement. He's kind of an underrated athlete and defender with some shooting upside, and he has some decent size to his build. Noah Clowney is a guy I find really interesting. He's kind of like a poor man's Taylor Hendricks, who I know we didn't have time to talk about, but Taylor Hendricks is one of my really, favorite picks potentially for the Jazz. Could fit into that 4 role and be really dynamic on offense and defense and kind of space the floor and do some fun things. Clowney's kind of similar to him in that way, just a really unique combination of size, length and athleticism with some shooting ability. Not a good ball handler, but really young player. Just really kind of interesting guy. I think he'd be interesting. And then guys like some of the older guys like Julian Strother or Ricky Council, who's not on my list but is now. Good athletes, can kind of fill a defensive like 3-and-D type role potentially, and just like know how to play ball. I think all those kind of guys in that tier would be really fun. And then if you really want to get exciting, I think doing like Amani Bates, who most people don't have in the first round, but
Yeah.
I think is just a super unique talent with his offensive upside. That could be a really fun one too. So I don't know. I like all those guys. I don't know if I like necessarily love any of them. That Brooklyn pick, if we kicked that down the road and didn't pick somebody from that tier, I wouldn't hate it, but I also wouldn't mind taking a swing on some of those guys in that tier. I think pretty much any of those guys you could make an argument for as being somebody that the Jazz could potentially be interested in.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question. Based upon your big board and how you've kind of prioritized certain guys, and comparing to kind of some of the industry consensus, are you more in favor of like keeping that that Brooklyn pick and making a selection, or are you kind of thinking, hey, you know what, maybe we could package that and something else and just kick it down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I think as always, it depends. Like, it depends on who is there. It depends on like how workouts go, right? And it depends on where our other two picks fall. Ideally, what I would really love. So in my perfect world, I love for the Jazz to get one top 5 pick and then another like top 16 pick,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then if we have that, like I don't really care what happens beyond that. I think we have a decent chance at getting into the top 5 with our own pick because I think we're going to tank really hard down here at the end of the season. So I think that's probably the only way you can do that. I don't think anybody in the top 5 is going to be trading out of that. Maybe potentially we like totally unload like half our draft capital to try and move into the top 5, but historically that's like almost impossible to do, and especially with the guys in this year's class, I just find that pretty unlikely, even if it's like a trade up scenario. But so then the question comes like, okay, are we going to get a top 16 pick with the Minnesota pick? It's been looking like we will, but recently maybe not. That's very much like on the knife's edge still. So like let's just say that pick falls outside the top 16 or even like the top, I would say like 12. I really would love like a top 12 or 13 versus like a top 16, but like let's say it falls to like 17, 18 range. I would package that pick with the Brooklyn pick and move up into that top like 10 to 12 to 13 range because I just think those guys are much better fits, and I really love the guys in that range for the Jazz. And I would rather do that than pick like a like two of like Maxwell Lewis and like Noah Clowney, right? Like I'd rather
Yeah.
have one Jet Howard or one Grady Dick or one Taylor Hendricks versus two of those other guys, right? So whether or not that's doable, I don't know, but I would prefer to do that. And then if we can't do that, then I don't know. It depends. Like if there's a guy there you like, great. If not, trade out of it, kick it down the road, gather more assets. I think that's totally fine too.
Yeah, yeah. My thought is that if the Jazz are floating around like the 9 to 11 range type thing, and there's someone at who drops to 7, like say a Sore Thompson drops to 7, I think that you try to trade your 9, 10, 11 pick plus the Brooklyn pick and maybe the Los Angeles Lakers pick that we got 2027, move up to that 7 range to get a Sore Thompson type thing.
Oh yeah, if any of the top 5 guys fall past 5, I'm trading all the picks in this year's draft plus the Lakers pick to try and go
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
Like easily. I might even go beyond that, but I would absolutely do that. If we came out of this draft with just one top 5 guy, I'd be stoked. I wouldn't need anything else.
So now that we went through your big board, just do you have any thoughts on the season? This season kind of took a lot of weird twists and turns, but I think it's been really fun. What are your kind of thoughts on the season? Feel free to take it any direction you want, but just, the Jazz this season.
Yeah, I have loved it. It's been so much fun. It's rekindled my fandom. I have not been shy about complaining over the last couple of years of the direction of the franchise and how I felt about the team and just everything that was going on. It was miserable knowing about all the drama and seeing it happen and having it show up on the court. The team just didn't have like the heart or the passion, and that made it really not fun for me as a fan. And it was very clear that they were not legit, right? I'm like pretty infamous for talking about how we were pretenders the whole time and predicting that. Not that I want to get into that, but I don't know. I really the before this year, like last season, I hardly watched any games, which was like the first time in my entire life that I had like intentionally not watched Jazz games. Like before that, I had watched every single game like ever, right? Throughout my entire life, and then last
Yeah,
year, I just
you were
didn't watch them.
notorious for moonlighting on Twitter and just being like, just checking in. Yep, my prediction's still holding.
Yeah. So I was really I was really happy they made changes. This year has been so much fun. I would have loved for them to lose a little bit more, so we had a little bit more confidence that they were going to get one of these high picks. But it's been so much fun. I can't really complain. And I also think just with how weird this season's been, with all the teams being so similar and close to each other in the standings this entire time, like we still are well within striking distance of a top pick, and I think we'll get there. And I think the franchise understands that, and I think Danny Ainge gets the needs of this team in this market and what we got to do to build an actual championship contender, not just a pretender that we peddle as being or as a as a championship contender, so we can sell more tickets. Like he's not about that, and he really wants to contend, and so does Ryan Smith. So I and it's been really fun. Like Laurie Markkinen, like he was a guy. I don't know how many people know this, but back when I was doing my scouting and writing, the two guys in that draft class that I wrote specifically that I would love for the Jazz to trade up for was number one, Donovan Mitchell. I loved Mitchell. I lost my mind when we traded up for him. That was so much fun.
Same.
And then the second guy was Laurie. Like I loved Laurie, and I loved the potential fit of Laurie here in Utah. So to have him come here and then kind of blossom into this player that I always felt like he could become, and he's doing it here in Utah, which is where I wanted him to be. Like personally, that's brought me a lot of satisfaction and has been a lot of fun because he was always one of those guys like, man, I totally missed on him, but now it's like, oh no, like I totally like I had that right, you know. Um, and yeah, like I don't know, Kessler being amazing out of nowhere was like super unexpected. Definitely missed on him. I don't know. It's just been super fun. That's how I would describe it, and I'm exponentially more hopeful about the future with the assets that we have, both current players and future with the picks. I think Hardy is like just a plus plus head coach. Like we totally knocked that out of the ballpark. I don't know. Everything is just lining up. I don't know what's going to happen, but I actually have hope again, and I'm having fun, and it's totally rekindled my fandom. So I am really appreciative of this season, and I've loved it. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it. Mark, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It's just been fantastic getting your thoughts, going through Big Board, talking about the future of the Jazz is just, like you said, it's very hopeful and very exciting, and been so kind of for the first time since like Donovan's like second or third year.
Totally. Yeah. It's fun, and Adam, thanks for having me on here. Always happy to talk ball, and appreciate the conversations that we have both here and off air. And I'm looking forward to things moving forward. It'll be fun.
Yeah, please give Mark a follow on Twitter at Mark W MARKW _E01. And if you like what we're doing here on the podcast, again, please subscribe to our podcast feed, to our YouTube channel, where you'll be able to see this video and see Mark's board as we kind of walk through it and talk about it. Also give us a follow on Twitter at @jabber_jazz. We look forward to more podcast episodes coming out, especially as we near the draft, and getting excited for that. So without further ado, as is kind of customary here on the podcast, we're going to leave you with some sounds of jazz.